The ostensible costs of this are going to be about £5 billion. I think it's going to be rather more than this. Now, approaching 500,000 people work in human resources. The figure 40 years ago would have been less than half of that. Where you have tighter regulation of labour markets, then it's the people who are entering the labour market, young people, who suffer most.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here. Today I'm joined by Professor Len Shackleton, who is our Editorial and Research Fellow and is the author of our latest discussion paper, Liberating the Labour Market. Len, I'm going to open with a big basic question here. What is a labour market?
That's an interesting question and one which people don't often ask, but in a country like ours, we spend a large chunk of our time working for an organisation who pays us for this. And like other transactions in a market economy, there are good ways of doing this and there are bad ways of doing this. And really what I want to talk about in this pamphlet is the better ways in which we could run the labour market.
So how does the labour market in the UK work? What sort of has defined historically Britain's labour market?
Well, it's the vast majority of people, something like 65%, work for a capitalist employer, if you want to put it that way. That is to say, for a for-profit business. The rest, about just over 20%, work in the public sector, and the rest work in what we might call the third sector, which includes charities and non-profits of various kinds. But a lot of our thinking about the labour market is driven, of course, by the 65% who are working for an employer. And the terms on which these kind of contracts are made is what labour market regulation is about and the sort of thing I talk about in this pamphlet.
So on the pamphlet, it's called Liberating the Labour Market. Why does it need liberating? How do you suggest going about that?
Well, in my view, and the view of a lot of economists, I think, we have spent the last 40 years or so putting increasing restrictions on the way in which contracts can be formed and employment can be carried out. And over time, I think this has had bad effects on the labour market. It's slowed our rate of economic growth. It's tied up a lot of businesses in compliance, in trying to get the rules right. One example of this, of course, is the huge spread of the human resource function in businesses. Now approaching 500,000 people work in human resources. The figure 40 years ago would have been less than half of that.
So what do you think, talk about the change from 40 years ago to today, when and what was the key turning point?
Well, people interpret this differently, but clearly, I just learned yesterday of the death of Norman Tebbit. And of course, Norman Tebbit was very much involved with Margaret Thatcher in trying to reform the labour market in the 1980s, in particular by reducing the power of trade unions, which had, of course, created all the problems in the 1970s, culminating in the winter of discontent in 1979 and the collapse of the Labour government of that period. So Norman Tebbit and Margaret Thatcher and various other people involved, of course, did manage to reduce the power of trade unions. But that led to a change in the way in which people thought about this. Unions, because their power was reduced, began to pay more attention to trying to get legislation to support their objectives rather than using the strike weapon, which has obviously been greatly reduced its influence as a result of the Thatcher reforms. And so we began from the late 1980s onwards, really, the trade unions pressed the Labour Party to take a much more active role in regulating the labour markets. And this was a time also, older listeners will remember when Jacques Delors came and talked to the Trade Union Congress about the benefits of the European Union legislation, which we eventually, when Labour came in 1997, we accepted the so-called social chapter of the what originally was the Treaty of Maastricht, which gave the European Union competence in the area of social regulation, economic regulation. And that led to quite a lot of things coming in from Europe, but it also led to a lot of domestic legislation as well. One example example of the way in which the social chapter changed things was in the interpretation of equal pay legislation. We'd had this in a very rudimentary form from the 1970s, but the European Union interpretation of this was much more expansive. And that has stayed, even though we've left the European Union, and has led to things like the notorious Birmingham City Council episode, where, as a result of the interpretation of equal pay legislation, Birmingham has basically gone bust because of the costs of paying female workers back pay for 6 years because they were judged in the courts to be underpaid in relation to male workers.
So that's one good example. But could you sort of paint a bit more of a picture of the sort of employment mandates to come about through this increasing regulation on businesses and the effect that's had on the wider economy?
Yeah, well, a mandate or a mandated benefit is a requirement by an employer to provide some benefit or other. Maybe, for example, something like parental leave or extended holiday entitlement or something like this. And of course, this is something which isn't directly a charge on the public purse, but it is nevertheless a kind of tax, a stealth tax, if you like, on employers who are obliged to provide these things. And of course, it costs money for employers. If you give people parental leave, then somebody else has to cover. You have to bring in people and so forth. This raises costs. Now, the thing which a lot of people don't realise, of course, is that though ostensibly this is a cost that falls on the employer, over time it falls on employees, because an employer now finds that it's more expensive to employ somebody, and they can't push up their prices particularly, so that the way this is dealt with over time is by paying smaller pay increases for workers. So in the end, workers tend to pay for the benefits which the employer is obliged to provide.
I think that's really interesting. I think the way I look at it is there's almost three costs or numbers to how much an employee costs. And tell me what you think about this. But to me, we often focus on the headline rate that is maybe put at the top of a job advert. Accountant on £30,000 a year, plucked out of thin air. And that is neither the number that the employee will get, because that doesn't account for income tax, national insurance, nor is it the number that the business will pay for that person, because it doesn't account for employers' contributions or all of the other pension contributions, but all of the other mandates that they have to find, even if they don't cost in sort of clear monetary terms, they have to find resources for somewhere. So the way you're putting it is the employment mandates add to that top cost of what the business has to pay to hire a new person.
Yes, the difference between what the employee gets and what the employer has to pay, economists call this the wedge, right? Which is the difference between these two costs. And of course, it does mean that it produces a misleading impression for people about who pays for what. And I think over time, the growth of this wedge has had very bad effects on the labour market. People don't understand what's going on, and therefore their behaviour alters in a way which doesn't help matters. I mean, over time, I think the increase in these kind of stealth taxes on employers has led to employers trying to find ways round them, and has led to things which have not always been beneficial to workers. Like, I mean, there's a big noise at the moment about 0 hours contracts, for example. 0 hours contracts are an understandable employer response to some of the costs which are associated with employing people on a permanent basis. And so you get these changes not because of some sort of nasty capitalist kind of thing, but simply a response which firms have to make. Firms can't just keep on paying things out. They've got to find a way of maintaining their profits at a level which enables a firm to stay in business, to invest, to pay shareholders and so forth.
It's individual actors and businesses with responding to the incentives.
Exactly so, yeah. And if you want to change the behaviour, you alter the incentives. You don't just sort of berate the employer for doing what comes naturally.
How does the UK stack up internationally? Anecdotally, we hear about, we often hear we've got quite good entitlement to holiday compared to, say, America, where they have far less. How do we stack up internationally, and what effect does that have in making us a competitive economy?
Yeah, for a long time, people pointed to the UK as having a relatively flexible labour market, being more towards the United States, Australia, New Zealand, than to the heavily regulated economies of the European Union. I think that advantage, if it is an advantage of flexibility and so forth, has been considerably eroded. And if you look at things like I quote in the pamphlet there, if we look at measures of the Economic Freedom Index, for example, of the Fraser Institute and the Heritage Foundation and organisations like this, over time, it's quite clear that our labour market has been the advantages of flexibility and not being tied down to so many rules is being eroded year on year. And of course, what we're getting at the moment is the Employment Rights Bill, which is just finishing its way through Parliament. It's been growing all the time. There's new amendments to it. Last time I looked, last week, I think there were 299 pages of it. It may have expanded since then because there's other things being discussed and so forth. And this is going to be a big hit, really, to many areas of business. And the ostensible costs of this are going to be about £5 billion. I think it's going to be rather more than this. I mean, one of the things in impact assessments, which the government do, is they tend to have a kind of minimalist interpretation of what the costs of a measure are. But what a lot of businesses, and particularly where they've got a strong HR function, is about defensive behaviour. So a law may say you have to do X, but the HR people will advise you to do X plus 1 or X plus 2 or whatever it is. And so you end up with greater costs than are strictly necessary. And that expansion of compliance costs, not only, of course, in the labour market, but we look at things like financial compliance and so forth. The whole economy is increasingly tied up with loads and loads of people doing nothing all day but checking on other people. They're not producing value. They're not producing output. And of course, this is one of the reasons why the economy is growing so slowly over time.
So looking at the Employment Rights Bill specifically and on the growth problem, the government is ostensibly saying that they prioritise economic growth. And we've talked loads on this different episodes of this podcast about where they are and where they aren't. But they keep saying that the Employment Rights Bill is a pro-growth measure, but the impact assessments don't seem to stack that up entirely. What's your take?
The benefits from the Employment Rights Bill are fairly nebulous. They tend to be things like, well, if people feel happier at work, they're going to be more productive. If their conditions of work are better, then they're less likely to leave jobs, so turnover will fall. There are benefits to this for employers, clearly, if turnover falls, because that means you have to recruit. The recruitment process is not repeated all the time. Training costs and things like this are reduced and so forth. So you can see some kind of benefits from this. But, if you actually look at what's happened over time when these kind of changes have been introduced, these benefits tend to evaporate. People don't get a great deal happier when some benefit comes in. Initially they may think they're better off, but it soon fades into the background. It's just something they absorb as normal. When new people coming in, they take it for granted. They're not particularly elated by it. So I think these sort of nebulous benefits are overrated in the rhetoric behind the Employment Rights Bill, whereas the real costs of it are definitely there, which even the government has to admit, as it has an impact assessment which says so.
And of course, possibly one of the best benefits that keeps employees happy for them to stay at their organisation is pay, presumably, which is going to be put in the opposite direction by the measure in this bill, we think.
Yes, insofar as there are costs to employers as a result of the Employment Rights Bill, then these costs will be passed on to the employee in due course. It may not be immediately, but over a number of years. It will be passed on in two ways, really. One in terms of lower pay, but also in terms of lower job opportunities, particularly, and this is an area I'm particularly concerned about, for young people, for entrance to the labour market. We know that where you have tighter regulation of labour markets, then it's the people who are entering the labour market, young people, who suffer most. So if you look at the very heavily regulated labour markets of countries like France, Spain, Italy, you find very high levels of youth unemployment. And that's a real problem potentially for the UK economy. We already have too many NEETs, people who are not in employment, education or training. And I think that some of the measures in the Employment Rights Bill will add to this total.
And especially when you consider it in the round with everything else the government is doing, arguably on welfare, but also on the national insurance rise on businesses and the rise in minimum wage, then the job prospects for younger people, all the prospects of businesses looking to hire younger people, suddenly that equation doesn't quite seem so appealing as it maybe once was.
Yes, I think this is a problem. I mean, we mustn't be too gloomy about this. And one of the things I do mention in this pamphlet is the fantastic ability of the private sector to generate jobs. Sitting in this room a few years ago, we were in a kind of gloomy mood about the response after COVID, where we thought there was going to be massive unemployment and jobs were going to be very hard to come by. But in fact, we got an explosion of new jobs. We had vacancies which reached record levels in 21, 22, etc. So the businesses can generate jobs. And incidentally, in passing, I would say here that the scare around artificial intelligence is greatly exaggerated. I think that the economies can always generate jobs if employers are free to do so and they're not tied down by regulations which add nothing to productivity.
Well, a nice bit of optimism is always welcome on the podcast, and too rare sometimes. I'd like to look at another part of the bill, the union measures. So it introduces lots of new measures for unions. It repeals some of the stuff that the previous government did on limiting their powers to strike. It gives them more access to employees through businesses, etc. Can you walk us through those a little bit and what you think the effect of those might be?
One of the things which you didn't mention, Callum, is the requirements before a strike can be held. A number of hurdles were in place, going back actually to the Thatcher period, before you can call a strike. Those hurdles have been considerably reduced. Moreover, a vote for a strike is now valid for a year. Previously, you had to, if you had a strike mandate and it expired after 6 months and you have to go back and have another vote, now you won't have to go back for a year. So that's going to be a thing. One of the things which I'm not quite sure what's going to happen about this, but it does appear that it's going to be easier for trade unions to acquire recognition by employers. At the moment, the procedure is unchanged. There is a body called the Central Arbitration Committee, where unions can apply for recognition, and at the moment, you can go and make a case to the committee on the basis of having 10% of a workplace unionised in your union. It looks like this is going to be dropped. No precise figure is being given in the bill, but you do hear these stories that it's only going to be 2%. This may lead to some increase in union recognition in the private sector, which has, of course, fallen off a cliff in recent years. And that may be of some interest. But I think the real problem is in the public sector. That's where all the strikes are. I mean, this morning I'm reading about the junior doctors, or whatever they ought to call themselves these days, resident doctors, who are, despite having stuffed their pockets with taxpayer money last year, are coming back for more. What a surprise. But, there are whole areas of the public sector where you're going to get, I think, increased militancy. Given that the powers in the Employment Rights Bill will improve the bargaining position of unions, you could expect two things to happen. Possibly one will be more strikes, but not necessarily, because the other could be higher settlements, right? That the government, faced with the potential for long strikes, would just cave in earlier than they would have done. So you could see that happening as well. So I think we may be in for a rather rough time with unions over the next few years. And I think it will eventually raise questions about whether striking in the public sector is as legitimate as we tend to think of it. Again, you mentioned it about international comparisons. But in Britain, we have very few strike bans. They're only in fairly obvious areas like the police and prisons and so forth. But a lot of our continental neighbours have much tighter restrictions. I mean, I was very interested to talk to a student of mine recently who had trained as a teacher in Germany. And was not allowed to strike because teachers in his sector are federal civil servants, and they're not allowed to strike under the German constitution. So that's an interesting one. Teachers' strikes are one of the banes of the life of parents like me, and maybe a dose of the German view on this might be of benefit.
Very interesting. Just before we wrap up, because we are running out of time, you make some suggestions in the paper about what things we could do to liberate the labour market a little bit more, to sort of mitigate for the recent restrictions that have been introduced. Want us to do a couple of those. People can go to the report to read them more through in detail, but what are your highlights?
I think, you could think of two things. One is sort of fairly short-run things. And the other, which I've tried to do here for any of you classical liberals listening, is to think about a very basic level of regulation. On the first part, I've suggested things like scrapping the apprenticeship levy, which has not increased apprenticeships and it just acts as a kind of extra payroll tax on employers. That's one thing. I've suggested that we have a big review of occupational regulation. That is to say, where the government defines who can undertake a particular job. And one particular example of this I've been moaning about for quite a while is the way in which, actually under the last government, under Sajid Javid, God knows why, the estate agents are now required to undertake formal training, pass exams and so forth. No country in Europe, and I've checked on this, has a similar provision. Dealing in property is not something which is exclusive to a caste of people who've had to go through all these exams. Now, the point about that kind of thing is, A, it reduces job opportunities, B, it raises costs to the consumer. And we've had an explosion of occupational regulation in recent years. I trace some of that in the book, where more and more the government requires people to jump through a lot of hoops before they can have a go at a particular profession. So occupational regulation is one which a particular bee in my bonnet, I guess. Excellent.
Well, that is, I'm afraid, all we do have time for, but that is an excellent place to end. There are loads of good tidbits and interesting propositions for how we fix this problem in the paper that you can now access on the IEA website at iea.org.uk. Thank you for joining us today, and until next time, thank you very much.